מה, אני כאילו חייב לכתוב?
מצלמת טיפה?
תמיר סטופ. Don't do nothing.
אפשר להגיד
איפה ברספסטה?
אוי, שמעתי את התיק שלי בחוץ.
המצלמה רצה.
אני חושב
אני אשלח לך,
אוקיי, אני
אשלח לך את זה.
בוואטסאפ טקט.
תודה רבה.
אני חושב שב-VP צריך לאפשר לממשלה לעלות ל-POI לממשלה אחרת. כן. אני אומר את זה כי כבר חשבתי לדבר על זה תמיד. אבל זה יצא כזה, במיוחד אם זה בסקולס, זה כזה יוצא POI'ים שהם כאלה, או גם אם זה VP, זה POI'ים שהם, בדיוק, זה כמו POI'ים של האום, של POI'ים שכזה, wouldn't you agree?
לא.
גם אני מנסה נורא לעזור לך. נראה לי שחסר ניתוח.
במדינות מסוימות יש כלי של פיליבסטר בבית מחוקקים, שאתה מדבר, וכל הזמן שאתה מדבר הם לא יכולים להמשיך. אבל לך להמשיך לדבר, שזה קשה הרבה זמן. אבל יש כלי של שאלת שאלות, וכל הזמן שמישהו שואל שאלה, יש חפוש. אז היו מקרים שמישהו התחיל לפיליבסטר, וכדי לעזור לו, אנשים שאלו אותו שאלות של שעתיים, תוך כדי שהוא נער, וחשו אותי,
זה סופר מעניין.
זה סופר מה?
I read the flow. זה שאין הגבלה רשמית על כמה ארוך תשובה ל-POI חייבת להיות.
טוב, יש.
On the outskirts of Marrakesh, there is an $800 million mosque, and around it, there are slums. There are people living without sanitation, there are people living without food, and there are people starving without electricity or water. We find this appalling. We would prefer to tax the $800 million mosque, maybe create a $600 million mosque, and give that money out to build schools in the slums which are around it. 3 arguments in today's debate. First is going to be about why we don't believe that a lot of these institutions need the money. The second is going to be about why we don't think that this is a vital enough the institutions are vital enough to justify giving them a special tax status. And my second speaker is going to talk about why I believe it is illegitimate to ask people to fund the religion of people who are from a different religion than themselves. Before that, 3 important points of criteria. First, notice how if we wouldn't give the special tax status to religious institutions like the church, institutions like the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, or the mosques, or a variety of different Orthodox, Jewish Orthodox constellations, we think that the amount of money we could tax off them is absurd. Organizations like the church are some of the richest in the world, right? The amount of money which goes into mosques is absurd, and we could get millions and millions of dollars had we have taxed them appropriately. Second point, which is important to framing, is that we believe that there's a very certain criteria to when we give something a special tax status, right? We believe that it needs to fall under 2 criteria. First, it needs to actually need the special money, right? Otherwise, we prefer to move that money elsewhere to other institutions like hospitals and like schools, which actually need it. The second criteria is that it needs to give a vital enough service to the people around it, right? We believe that if these institutions don't give a vital enough service, we prefer to fund things again like schools, like hospitals, like very important industries, which wouldn't survive without it and which would do a better service. The third and last piece of framing is the following, right? We believe that what we're proposing is just to limit, not give them the tax status in this particular case. If there are certain, we're not against helping religion in any way as a government, rather we're just against a blanket policy giving things like the Catholic Church as a whole the entirety of a special tax status, and if necessary with the extra money we'll be more than happy to say fund local community churches if that is something which is so important to the local neighborhood. Before I continue, if there are any questions about the frame, sure.
Wait, so you want to have remove the tax on all churches, no matter how rich or poor they are, but then only fund the poor?
to a very large extent, that is something which we'll be willing to do. Obviously, we don't think that it's that large. We think we tax say the Catholic Church or the Vatican and get way more money of it. And if we need to, we'll fund 2 or 3 local churches which need the money. But now I'm going to explain why in the majority of cases they won't need the money. Let's go in to my first point of substantive, if they accept our framework, which they seem to accept. Let's move in to the first point, right? And to a very large extent, we don't believe that these churches or these religious institutions actually need the money. Why is that? Twofold. First, we believe that a majority of these cases, a majority of these institutions, are wasting absurd amounts of money according to the services that they're giving, right? We give you the example of the Vatican and the extravagance in which the people live. We give you the amount that cardinals are earning. We give you the amount that the prominent imams are earning, which is far, far larger than they need in any sense of purpose. There are only tens of thousands of dollars who simply live in a life of extravagance which they don't actually need. That's why we believe that in many cases, had we cut down on the amount of rubies which are in a certain church, or the amount of beauty of the church or what have you, we wouldn't actually stop them from giving the basic service, which is offering the place of prayer or what have you, right? We think that to a very large extent we could cut down on the money that these places have and use it elsewhere by the taxes. The second reason we don't believe that they need, or that they need the special tax things, is because to offer the very basic services of prayer, of religion, it's simply not that expensive. You don't need a church the size of I don't know what. You need a small local church who can offer religion, they can offer a prayer booth to the people who actually need it. Why is this important? On the very basic level, we say that there are enough hospitals, enough schools which need the funding. If we can take the money from the places which have it and have more than enough of it and won't stop existing without this money, we much prefer utilizing it where we need it most. Before I continue to my second point, yes?
Why not literally any other tax in the world? So for example, 1% more property tax for the rich or corporation tax. Why specifically the rich churches are the problem?
We'll say if that is a good way to make more money, we do that as well. We think that particularly when there are very, very large organizations which a lot of money, which are paying only 20% when they should be paying 40% tax, that is far more significant than adding 1% tax on corporations, also given that adding 1% tax on corporations could limit industries, etc., something which we don't believe that taxing churches more will do, just like I just gave you in my point, right? And the third reason that we don't think that will be limiting the amount of churches or local churches which are around, even in poor areas, which we believe is going to be the majority of the case, is because we believe that, for a very large extent, the richer areas or the richer religious people help fund smaller communities, etc. Why? Because in all of the monotheistic religions, and also in Buddhism and Hinduism, right, the biggest religions around the world, it is in itself a divine doctrination to help others create their religion, right? So definitely in Christianity, if I help another person fulfill his Christianity and allow it to have a local church, that is a divine, I need to do that for religious reasons, all right? That's why we believe that charities for these kinds of things are going to be incredibly large. So even in small communities, without such a rich local community, they'll still be able to continue to exist. A, because it's not so expensive to run a local church, and B, because there will be more than enough people who are willing to give the appropriate amount of money in charity to let them fulfill their religion. Given that, let's move on to my second point about why we don't believe it's so vital, right? And here the comparative, we believe to a very large extent, is hospitals, it's schools, it's very important industries, etc., right? And why do we believe that they're far more vital? First reason, we believe that even without religion, people can continue to live their life, right? Even if they have a bit less, and specifically even if they don't have the institutionalized religion, they still believe in a God. They still have the meaning which they can get from religion because they still believe in the very basic essence of God, that someone's looking over them, above them, etc. They still have the very basic functions of community, etc. They can still exist perfectly normal. Something which they can't do if, for example, they don't have access to a hospital and they can't have the very basic medication that they need to survive, right? That's why on the very basic level we believe that things like hospitals are far more vital than things like churches. The second reason we believe that to a very large extent, churches and religion can often be oppressed, right? We give you the example of the way they treat women. We give you the example of the way they treat homosexuals, right? We're not sure that they're as much of a net benefit as things which are very much good, right? We don't think that hospitals can do bad for a society, but we are fairly sure that religions which appease women and they sign a niqab or ostracized gay people can do a lot of harm to a lot of people, right? Third reason that we don't trust religions to be as important or as much of a best benefit than the alternatives is the following, right? We believe that often the concept that I have a God above me, looking about me about for everything I do, is often a bad incentive, specifically for the poorest people who need to get themselves out of the rut, right? We would prefer a world, or we would be more willing to prefer a world in which A, they have the education to get themselves out of the rut, but B, the motive, because they believe that the only way that they can't trust in a God above them, but rather they trust their own abilities, right? For all these reasons, we believe not only do these institutions need the money, but also that it's not as important as the other function, the other utilities we could use the money for. For these reasons, propose.
Before speech, I call the leader of opposition. תומסים לב את מה שאתה מדבר ומגיע לי יותר חשבונך משמע כל דבר.
סבבה, הבנתי. זה חלק מהנקודה הראשונה שלהם. זאת אומרת, זה חלק מהנקודה הראשונה.
משהו שאני אפשר להשאיר את כל האינטגרציה.
גם שלי לא, אבל כאילו מה לעשות. כן.
Hi, when you're ready. No, I'm sorry, I need it like that. There's no back.
Yeah. So
We do now officially hate you, sorry.
A government in a debate isn't a government in a real life. They cannot just say, yeah, we just give the money to the poor churches and everything will be fine. This is obviously not how things work, and this is obviously not how politicians' incentives will work, and this is why we believe it needs to be something for everyone, and this is going to be my first point of rebuttal. After the rebuttal, I'm going to have 2 points. The first one is going to talk about the necessity of those churches in the small neighborhoods, and also the big impact that the big churches and the big religious institutions have on also all the impacts that they are trying to show that we are losing in the status quo. The second thing is going to talk about the radicalizations of those religious institutions and why they are going to hate them much more. So before that, what do we want to say about them? Yeah, we'll go and fund the small one who needs it. We just believe that this is not how it works. We don't understand why the politicians would have the incentive to put the money, no thank you, to put the money there. Why wouldn't they, if they are the one to explain us why education is the most important thing, why hospitals is the most important thing, no thank you. Why the heck are they going to care about the small places? We believe that under their logic, they are going to just invest all their money in those stuff, and we believe it is a crucial harm for people, which is going to be explained in my point. The second thing, and a very important, no, I'll do it in my point as a direct clash. So, point, okay. So, we believe that two things can happen. This point is going to divide and talk about small institutions and big institutions. Let's start with the small ones. We believe that many of them, without those tax breaks, are just going to close. They are depending on those things because religious institutions are much more than just prayer on Sunday. They are giving money. They are donating to the small communities. The people in those neighborhoods depend on them many times economically. No, thank you. Many times economically, and we believe that this is a very important thing because another thing that churches and the Catholic Church and any religious institution does is it is donating money to the poor people. Soup kitchens is one of the biggest things that churches that religious institutions do. We believe that many people depend on. Even if we're talking about the big institutions which aren't going to close up, they are now going to get less money. This is when they are going to decide in what to invest more and in what to invest less. So, or they are going to close them up, or they are going to invest much less in some things. But wait. Now Agar would come in as a rebuttal, but wait, you want to say that all the things that we want the government to be in charge of, you are saying the church is doing already. We think that the church is already doing all the things that Tamir is so concerned about education for poor people. We believe that those institutions are in the position that the proposition is so afraid people not managing. But more than that, we believe that those religious institutions are much better in doing this stuff than the government. Why? Because the poor people aren't the one to have the political capital for the people, for the politicians. Those people, no thank you, we believe that religious institutions has much more incentive to do all of that because those are the things they believe in. Those are the things that, beside tax breaks that help them fund themselves, they get many donations who are coming in those favor. Yes, they are getting donations, but there is a limit to the amount of donations, and they cannot do everything. And at this point, they would have to decide. And the religious institutions are much better in focusing on the stuff because the poor people are the one voting. The poor people are the one with the political capital. And this is why we believe that the government isn't going to invest as much as the church does. Before I continue into my second point, yes.
Given that the majority of the believers in Pope Francis' faith are poor, or sometimes can't feed themselves, why does Pope Francis carry around a litter and red ruby necklaces?
What? Okay, we believe like a personal individual wants to help himself. We believe like it's not all the institution, not sure. Okay, so moving into my second point. They are talking, and this is coming direct clash to their not so analyzed point about like bad ideas that those institution brings. We asked you, why should we care? Would you stop funding the Republican Party in the USA? Would you stop funding any right-wing parties? Most chances that you won't. That we are not talking about super racist parties that we don't allow by law. We believe that there are some ideas that we might not support, but they are legitimate ideas to have, and we believe that it happens all in other sections, fields in the world that we continue to fund because we believe. And we believe that under this logic, just that we see that we are doing this stuff, and we believe that it is a legitimate idea to hold. We believe that this shouldn't be a criteria if we should fund something or not. Before I continue, yes.
We're not saying that they're not allowed to think that way. We just think that if it is so harmful to many groups of people, this is not something that we should encourage as the government.
But why is it so harmful? You're not explaining it to us. But you know what? Let's do the real analysis here, why it is going to be much more harmful. Those small institutions, but also the big ones, are now going to believe that the government is taking their power away. We believe this is the point when they are just going to be mad. They are going to be mad and hate much more everything they are not there. But more than that, this is the point when the small people and the poor people the poor people cannot use the money they give them. They cannot depend on them. And this is when they need to go and look for other things. This is when the religious institutions would like to stop them because they would like to keep them safe and as a community. And this is when they are going just to be much more extreme. They wouldn't like them to go to education systems that the government, who took out the power core of them is funding. They would like their ideas to continue and roll the community because this is why they are important. This is where they're going to be much more extreme. Legitimate idea, much more harm on our side, and just it is a necessity. Thank you.
Thanks for speech. I'm going to call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Maya, leave the picture. Thank you, sweetie. Second. Literally all of opposition's case rests on the fact that they just didn't take into account Tamir's speech, which literally had answers to all of their case, which they didn't care to rebut for 1 single second. I'm going to have quite a few rebuttals for what we heard from Maya, and then I'll be explaining, going over our criteria for justification, why we think that it's justified for us to do this, and then we'll talk a bit more about the money, where it goes, where it goes in the status quo inside these religious institutions and stuff like that. Let's start with a few rebuttals first. So they tell us, look, all of these small churches and stuff, they're going to close, right? They're going to collapse. They're not going to have enough money, etc., etc. Note, this doesn't answer in one sentence all of Tamir's analysis, which tells you why they're going to have enough money to continue building this house, right? We said a few things under this. First, we said, look, like donations and things like that are still going to exist, and they're going to exist to a larger extent when, they're going to exist to a larger extent on our side of the house, because now there is more need for them to be there and stuff like that. We think that in a lot of religions, supporting other churches and supporting other mosques or whatever is something that is very important, and people in these religions do that a lot. They're not going to collapse, okay? But more than that, we tell you, look, what we're against here is not supporting religions. We are against a blanket policy which just says all of you and all religious institutions, we're just going to give you, we're going to give you less tax because you're a religious institution. So if it's a poor church or something like that that is going to need the money, now we have more money to give to decide how exactly we're going to put in these churches, because the rich churches do pay taxes and we have more money from them, right? So it's not a blanket policy. So what we're against here is the mere blanket policy and not against generally supporting religion. This is a differentiation side opposition needs to understand, because their whole first speech ignored this, even though it was very clear in Tamir's speech. Now, look, then there was something about how these churches are going to be so much better in education and stuff like that, and why they have the incentive to do this. First of all, look, most of these religious institutions, religious churches aren't really built on these kind of values, right? The people in the high levels of these churches, the Pope, the bishops, whatever, they walk around wearing rubies everywhere, right? While millions of their believers don't really get money. But more than that, we say that we say that when the government has more money from these taxes, then more of these people are going to get things like education, things like that, which the government is obligated to give to its citizens, right? And now it has more of an option to do this. And we don't understand why, first of all, even if you don't buy this is directly against the analysis. This is based on the assertion that the churches are going to be weakened. Again, we explain to you why we don't think that is true, why they're still going to have money to fund all of these things if they want them to. But more than that, on our side, not only do these churches have more money, the state has more money to use to fund these kinds of places. So again, all of this rests on not answering Tamir's analysis and his case. So all of their case up till now, all of their case falls. Let's talk a bit about radicalization, right? Again, they tell us, look, now they're going to be much more closed off, right? They're not going to like the state and stuff like that. And we say, all of that rests on Tamir, on like the analysis we already gave you. When these places will have more money and they will have more donations and stuff like that, they're not going to collapse, so there is no reason for them to get closed inside and whatever. More than that, we say that the state is going to the state can now specifically help the weaker parts of the religion, the ones that are going to collapse in the smaller communities and stuff like that. The state has now more access to help these kinds of places, so we don't get why they won't like the state. If anything, they'll like it more on our side of the house. And before I go on, any POIs? No, cool, let's move on. Let's talk a bit about to make our case clearer, because they need to answer this in their next speech. Just note, like, you have this next minute to raise a POI. If you don't, then too bad. Right, it's schools. Anyways. Okay.
Now you should be working on POI.
Yeah.
Exactly, because even though in status quo many people are poor and still they invest $800 million in rubies, it seems to me as if luxury and all these things have important religious value that is important to the Pope to continue, and for even the poor believers.
No, there's a difference. Okay, look, there's a difference between the way in religious institutions are built and the way actual religion is built. We think that for too long, religion and religious institutions have been based on the fact that there needs to be like this hierarchy and the Pope needs to be super rich and things like that. We think that this, again, as Tamir told you in his speech, we think that this is something the poor people don't realize is bad for them, and they could live better lives in which they still believe in their God and in the church and whatever that may be, but they don't. But the money they get doesn't depend on the Pope and whatever. Okay. Quick clarification of our case, which I hope they will get to answering sometime soon. We told you our criteria was this: we don't support a blanket policy. Okay, we don't support giving tax breaks to every religious institution. We think that is something that is illegitimate because religion is not vital enough. It is not something like health, which you literally are going to need in every single step of your life. And we think that this money is better off in other places that is not supporting specific people and specific institutions. Now that we have more money from not giving tax breaks, to all of these bodies, we can now. Oh, BP. We can now give this money to the poor institutions and institutions that need it, and we can make wiser decisions with how we allocate this money, right? We think that taxes fundamentally is something that everyone needs to be paying. It needs to be paying to their ability. The churches do have the ability to pay, the churches or the religious institutions, if they have the ability to pay these taxes as a blanket, as a whole, then they should be doing it. We think that on their side of the house, this money often goes, yes, to things like corruption, to things like buying a crystal watch for the church, because for some reason they really need that, right? Instead of being able to go to the other poor churches, maybe in the other side of the country that this church doesn't know anything about. We think that on our side, we can allocate the money better. We have everyone paying taxes equally, and seeing as they didn't answer in one word the analysis we already gave you, we are winning this debate already, and please propose.
What are your titles?
יש לי קייס שמדבר על אפילו אם...
No, read me the titles.
אז אחד זה
Read me the titles.
First is just justification. Do they deserve the tax breaks? Second of all is the practical impact of where the money will go, why it's important for people, and weighing. And lastly, a positive point on why we think it's terrible that a state funds directly religious institutions.
Okay, fine.
Terrific.
One moment. Just a second.
תמיר עשה ביצ'ינג שאתה לא תספיק לנקודה, אז תגיד.
זה אני אסביר?
לא עשיתי.
אני עשיתי ביצ'ינג על זה.
רגע לפרצוף שלו.
זה לא יפה. זה גזעני.
Why don't you spend this time during Thomas' speech developing a point, unless it's Thomas' point, in which case I misunderstood from the title, but why, irrelevant of all consequences, we must give religious institutions tax breaks. Why? I'll just work
We
with
already
this.
have one.
What? That's Thomas' point?
לא בדיוק.
No.
No, I didn't think so. Then it's fine. I'm not saying you should run that now. This is what I'm going to work on analyzing that point right now. Okay?
Which point? I
It
didn't
says,
understand.
irrelevant of the consequences, irrelevant of anything else, we have some kind of obligation as the state to give people, to give churches a tax break. Good. Okay, Tom, go.
אוקיי. טוב, אני חושב שצריך להסביר.
Tom, אני לא אכתוב.
I think there's a very good reason church and state have been long separated, and we think it has a terrible impact when, for example, the state of Israel is now responsible of funding mosques around Israel, and what impact it does on the entire Islam community in, for example, Israel, France, Germany, and all these places. But first of all, 2 parts in my rebuttal. First of all, on justification, second of all, on practicality. They keep using the words blanket ban when they misunderstand that they are the blanket bans. When they say, we will end all tax breaks to all institutions, while we don't have to support giving tax breaks and the exact same tax breaks to literally all institutions. So that's when their case, which is specifically on the $800 million mosque and stuff like that, gets particularly problematic, because the first thing we would like to do is say, you know what? Let's not give those tax breaks to specifically those, even in the worst case. We're also going to explain why they deserve tax break and should get it, but we can specifically say, you know what, for those mosques, you're right. For the tiniest minority of cases, let's not give them tax breaks. When they run away from the debate, literally 800 million miles away from the debate, and say, we're going to tax break, but then give them the money to the exact amount of tax breaks, but then only to the minority of churches, those are the ones we won't give tax breaks to. They're running away from the debate, and they're the ones giving the. Let's continue. So for the overwhelming majority of churches, we simply say they deserve the tax breaks. Please note the 2 criteria we got from Tamir. First of all, they have incredibly important social value. Obviously, when we give entire miles analysis where the majority of churches that are, as Tamir already admitted in his POI, responsible for relatively poor communities or middle class, where they oftentimes are responsible for charities, for things like, oh, one family had their house burned down, let's help them out. Responsible for running soup kitchen. Responsible for simply giving meaning through religion, all these things, and obviously need the money to do it. And let's disconnect it for a second from donations and stuff like that. We simply say for the overwhelming majority of their churches that aren't the $800 million churches, they simply deserve the tax break, irrespectively from whether we'll fund them anyway. They simply deserve the tax break under their own analysis, where they need the money and they are responsible for an incredible part of meaning and stuff like that. The only direct rebuttal to that we get is, oh, but they are against gays and stuff like that, or maybe religion is not that good for poor. First of all, that's a really weird argument, because you want to literally fund all those things, you just don't want them to call it tax breaks, so it's unclear to me what the impact is. Second of all, we think a large majority, for example, in the Bronx, most of the churches are actually relatively progressive because it's in New York. But lastly, more importantly, please note, that's why Maya's example is incredibly important. When we say we fund and we give tax breaks to all parties, even if they're against gays, even if they're against, and we actively support them by the state, not just let them exist, actively support them, we say it's when you are responsible for an incredible part of meaning and democratic process in people's lives, we don't care if you do it. Let's continue. But then let's go to practicality, because obviously this clash gets more important if we also are able to prove to you that they won't get the funding they're talking about. Because their entire defense is, oh, don't worry, we'll fund all poor churches, they're not going to miss a dime. So, first of all, we say this is incredibly unlikely. Poor communities are poor for a pretty good reason. They're oftentimes discriminated for a variety of reasons, either because they're connected to a certain kind of majority, for example, Muslim majority that isn't very well liked. Either it's because this also means that they're very unlikely to fund specifically their mosques, for example, when it is incredibly unliked by the majority of the population. The fact that they're much less powerful financially, which means they're far less able to protest, far less likely to actually go out and vote. All the regular reasons why poor people are significantly less powerful, which means it is very unlikely for the exact same money to go to them and not to people preferring that the same money we get will be directed to other places. But lastly, please note, we said that even if at the beginning they'll fund them to the exact same extent, the moment there's any financial problem, we're having a deficit, where it's a week here, we need to bring money to another place, it's the easiest place to take money from, especially when, for example, we suddenly have a Muslim crisis where there's a lot more anti-Muslim rhetorics, where it's incredibly likely to have money taken from the funding for example, mosques in London. But lastly, please, let's continue. The entire case is, obviously the same thing goes for like donations. Obviously, we simply don't think it's enough to cover, like it's unclear to me why they think there's enough donations to cover the churches in the random Bronx. Who exactly would give the donations? Why they don't do it now? Second of all, it's even less true for specifically like religions that are weaker. For example, it's not the Catholic Church, it's a different kind of stream of religion. So for example, Reformic Jews. It's not Christianity, it's Islam in Europe, which is incredibly poor. Why do they have the ability to give those donations instead of the tax rate? But lastly, their entire case is, but they're rich churches, so we get taxes from them and therefore hospitals. So the first positive thing, so just to point out, there's literally zero analysis in their case why the likely scenario is the money going to hospitals for the poor and schools for the poor, because we don't think in the US the reason there's less funding for schools for the poor is because there's not enough money in the world. We can't take any more taxes, therefore there's no money. We think it's much more likely that there's simply the money will go to security and more funding for the US Army, more funding for rich schools and all that. First positive point I have is why specifically the rich, before I move on, why specifically rich churches are incredibly important for example, Christianity and why it will continue. We simply think that according to the concept of Christianity, showing love for the Lord is in very ways in the entire history of Christianity connected to a very large extent to how big the church is, how fancy it is, how much we use our own wealth and our own physical aspects to show how much we love the Lord, show how great He is, show how powerful He is. That is also why churches are not look like schools, but look like incredible buildings. That is oftentimes specifically destined to show the power of the Lord, how rich and powerful He is, and a way in Christianity's eyes to show our love for Him. But by that we give up a lot of the richness that we have in showing love for Him. That's why we think that they don't change that in any way. So the Catholic Church will still prefer to have those rubies on their dresses, but they're likely to give, yes, sure.
They can't have it either way. Maya can't tell us the most important thing for the Catholic Church is charity, and then Thomas tell us that...
No, that's not what she said. She said in specifically poor places, charity is a bigger part of what they do. In the rich places, the $800 million mosque, it's definitely not. We think there are different causes for different type of mosques. The more poor their neighborhood is, the more likely charity is a bigger part of the community work and the church's goals. When it's an incredibly rich mosque in the middle of Saudi Arabia or Qatar, it's probable that donations is not a huge part of what they do. That's also why, specifically when you take taxes from them, the first thing they're likely to do less is, for example, charity work that is likely to happen significantly less under their sign. So, for example, the Vatican currently invests incredible amounts of money in helping refugees in El Salvador. The moment there isn't that, we think that specifically the Vatican is likely to give. Oh, fuck me. So, for all these reasons, I beg you to talk to Yes, I'm very sorry. That's it. So,
At 6:56.
yes, I know.
Tomer.
Not make it like this.
No, you're gonna give it again.
What?
You're gonna give it again.
We give it again?
מה?
Okay.
You rewarded behavior?
אבל למה אני אמור לעשות דיברתי לה? הנאום הראשון לנאום
Wants
השני.
to leave.
תיקח
לא,
ממנו...
אני דיברתי על הנאום הראשון. הנאום השני זה בשבילי ובשביל תומר, לא בשביל הדיבר.
אז אני אצא עכשיו מהחדר.
אוקיי, אני אעשה את זה כמו שצריך.
בסדר.
אני לא רוצה
לא,
לשמוע.
פשוט שייתן את הנאום בסוף, לא?
לא, he's leaving.
When
You don't have to leave. He wanted to go to the
Wait, he's giving a reply.
That's a good point, but
לא, אני חייב לעזוב. אני אמרתי כבר כאילו 606.
let me think about this a second. Naya is going to give a reply. מה?
טוב.
לא, finish
I'll do it.
Finish it now, and then you can reply. You have a lot of extra time because I'm giving you an extra 8 minutes.
כן, אבל אני לא הקשבתי לה. טוב, בסדר.
עכשיו את לא צריכה להקשיב.
סבבה, אני אעשה את זה, טוב, אני אעשה את זה כמו שצריך עכשיו. 3.
את לא חייבת. אם את ממש לא רוצה, זה לא קריטי.
ריפליי ונתח.
עכשיו הבנתי לך.
את רוצה לעשות את הריפליי? לדעתי זה לא טוב.
כן, אני אשמח.
אוקיי, אז תנתחיל את הנקודה ואז תתני את הריפליי.
אוקיי.
אני שנייה עוזרת לה.
אין בעיה.
אוקיי. עכשיו אני הבנתי מה.
Okay, now,
I know how to do it.
stop. What were the problems?
אני חושב שהרבה היה בלגן בתוך הריבטל,
נכון.
שיצא לי הרבה יותר מדי זמן, היה מידה מסוימת של חזרתיות
נכון.
בריבטל.
איפה הייתה החזרתיות?
בהצדקה, הרבה מהצדקה תלוי בדברים כמו, כי ההצדקה תלוי באלף כזה אימפקט חברתי ומה הכנסיות האלה עושות, וגם תלוי בזה שלא יקבלו מימון בדרך אחרת, ואז גם הרבה מהפרקטיקה זה היו תשובות ספציפית על זה, אז זה היה חזרתיות. אוקיי.
I'm going to tell you your structure.
What?
I'm going to have structure-wise. First point of rebuttal.
Okay.
Why? Well, you can have the frame you had. I'm okay with that, right? But first point of rebuttal is why under the motion these churches no longer exist.
Okay.
Second point of rebuttal, frankly, you don't need one.
Yeah.
Right? Well, like, what's your second point of rebuttal?
כאילו אני יכול טיפה ריבטל לקייס הספציפית שלהם, אבל כן.
בסדר, אני לא חושב. נראה לי זה יהיה לבזבז את הזמן שלך.
כן.
Go, fine, go.
3, 2, 1. 3 parts in my speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about the practical impacts and where the money will actually go. Second of all, on justification, whether they resume tax breaks. Thirdly, I'm going to bring a positive point of what happens when specifically the state funds actively churches and mosques, for example, and what impact will they have on them. First, let me just frame one quick thing. They keep on saying the words, oh, we're blanket bans and we're the ones supporting it. Well, what they misunderstand is, well, we can support giving tax breaks to certain churches, especially, for example, the majority of churches, and not specifically to the $800 million mosque. They cannot. They have to defend not giving tax break to literally any church, poor or not poor. Why? Let's begin. The main thing that they use for their defense is, but don't worry, these churches will exist anyway because obviously we're going to fund all of them equally no matter how poor they are. Several reasons that some of them already come in my speech for why that's false. First of all, many of the poor churches are connected to specifically minorities. So for example, mosques, in a very large majority of the cases, is poor Muslim communities all over Europe that are unlikely to get the same amount of funding in cities where the majority doesn't like their religion, doesn't like them, they are weak immigrants. Some of them don't even have the ability to vote, definitely not to unionize and have enough political capital, which means it's incredibly unlikely to get voluntarily funding if it's not in the rules where you don't get tax breaks. Second of all, this also in those specific communities also means that there are the weak communities that are unlikely to have funders from somewhere because these weak Muslim communities in Europe are unlikely to have many rich funders that can afford to build all these mosques. Second of all, even when it's big religions, right, for example, Catholicism, we simply say that oftentimes, well, because they are poor, they have less rights, they vote on a weaker percentage, they have less political power, they have less financial power, which means they donate to politicians less. It is oftentimes the case that there's less an incentive to invest in them. So for example, even if we technically have the money now, if we would ever need them for any future project, we want to build a railway, we have a deficit, anything like that, it's incredibly easy to take the money specifically from them. That's also the reason why, for example, there's a current disparity in their hospitals, in their schools, simply because it was easier not to give them the money in the first place because they're much weaker politically. And lastly, when they say, oh, don't worry, donations will fix all the problems, we simply don't think that's the case. Obviously, it's not the case for anything that isn't like the major religions such as Catholic churches, but second of all, it's especially not the case since we simply simply don't believe there are enough donors and enough money in donations to make sure that every small church in the Bronx will be able to exist. But lastly, even if there's enough money to make sure the church doesn't close, obviously there will be less donation. There's less money to do things like fund soup kitchens, fund charitable work and all that, which we think is also an incredible important part of their work inside the community. Lastly, they say, let's talk about, they're the rich churches, we get taxes from them. So the first thing we say is, look, we simply think that to a very large extent, being rich and having all these rupees is an incredibly important part of for example, Catholic Christianity. We think that oftentimes it comes from a perception of, this is a way to show our love for the Lord, this is our way to show how the Lord is great, and Hagar admitted herself that it's the current perception inside Catholicism that is incredibly important. We say that if you cancel tax breaks, that's unlikely to change. What's much more likely to happen is for those Catholic churches to pay the taxes, keep being incredibly rich, and simply giving up their money in different places. So for example, funding other churches in the Bronx a lot less. For example, funding other things like charitable work in El Salvador to save refugees a lot less.
Stop it. Slow down. Take a break.
Okay.
Take a break. No, don't stop the talk. Take a break. In, out. Another one. Nope, another one. Okay, now talk slowly.
That, we think, is a much more likely scenario of how will the Vatican, for example, use their money. Especially, second of all, please note, even if they get all these tax funds, it's unclear to me why they think the likely scenario is them going to the hospital anyway. Because we simply think that for the majority of cases, the reason that hospitals in poor cities are incredibly worse than hospital in a richer part of the city is not because there wasn't enough money to make these hospitals decent in the first place, but because they have incredibly low political power and no incentive to invest in them. That's why we think, even though some of the money would go to these poor neighborhoods, the overwhelming majority of the money would keep going to where it goes in status quo, to richer areas, to richer people, to security, to richer schools, and that we think is a much more likely scenario. Lastly, let's talk about my positive point on involvement and power.
Before that,
yes.
Let's be very clear that charities and the charities that local churches do is out of the debate. Why is that true? Because the money which is brought to these charities isn't going to be taxed tomorrow because it's anyway brought as a donation.
No, it doesn't work. Obviously, it doesn't work that way. You don't mark your bills as in this goes to church work, this goes to charity work. It's the churches have overwhelming, like a fund that they get in total. A lot of the tax, then they use the money to, for example, invest in soup kitchens, for example, invest in work they do in like community work that is otherwise. It's unclear to me why specifically those tax breaks, it's not separated that way. Let's continue. Look, their main thing they support is, but now we're going to fund all these religions and all these mosques, and that's going to be a great scenario. Here's what I think is incredibly likely. The moment the US has in its power the ability to close any mosque because they decide to cut funding to it, here's what's much more likely to happen. They'll pressure them and not fund mosques that in their eyes express too extreme ideas or too radical ideas. They're much more likely to pressure mosques to, for example, cooperate with authorities and give out people who are in their confessions or whatever they call it to give information on believers of those who they seem as extreme, pressure mosques to be as moderate as possible. But it's not just specifically those cases. We also think that the moment that Orthodox Jews control the funding of Reformic Jews in Israel, and not only Reformic Jews, but specifically also Orthodox Jews that are a different stream of them, their ability to pressure these churches to not exist, their ability to pressure these places to, for example, not go against the current stream or anything like that is incredibly likely. We think that specifically because there are incredibly powerful religions and incredible incentive for them to crack down on other streams of their religion, on other streams of their specific perception, on, for example, churches of dissidents and people who criticize the Catholic Church or stuff like that.
If you don't have a good summer, you're going to be very upset.
What? their ability to just police whatever is said in these churches, whatever type of religion you're passing, whatever the type of pastor there is, the ability of the US to police what counts as extreme Islam and unwelcome Islam in these places is, we think, incredibly dangerous. That is exactly why, even if you fund them to the fullest, you still don't get the function that they're supposed to get, because oftentimes they'll be policed and unable to give to the believers the exact religious belief they deserve to get. Because of all these reasons, I beg you to oppose. Maud.
Summarize your case. Reach your point before 6 minutes. Inside your rebuttal, you're still repeating things to an extraordinary degree. You say lastly 4 times. On 4 different points you say lastly. And then inside each of those lastlies you have multiple subpoints, which some of them are the same thing. It's the same thing, you say 1, and then you say 2, and 1 and 2 are the same thing, and then in 2 you repeat the first lastly. I wasn't writing, as I said I wouldn't, but specifically the easy example is when you talk about how expensive churches and expensive things in churches are important to people, you then return again to, and therefore this means that if you take away the money, then they're not going to donate the money to the poor people, and the poor people have no political power. The poor people have no political power is something you said 7 times.
Okay.
I understand, yes, you think the poor have no political power. I don't really know why you think that is, though it's school, so you get to just say that, and that's probably true, you'd be debating as well. So okay, but what value you saying it 7 times? What's the value of saying it under a point where you're trying to justify the legitimacy of giving the money to big churches? It has nothing to do with it. You have to be more organized. You have to be clearer. You have to slow so far down. You have to give up on clever ideas you think of in the middle of a piece of rebuttal. Just because something came up in your head while you were speaking and it seems clever just doesn't mean it's worth saying, even if it's actually clever, which it probably is, because the judge isn't going to understand it. Okay? I'm going to let you go. However, 2 things. 1, at your speech tonight at university, who's Monica's judging?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to ask her what you did. And if I don't hear that your speech was organized, I don't care if it's a whip speech or you can DLO, right? If it wasn't organized, if it didn't have a clear summary of what happened in the speech, if it didn't have a clear opening, if the connection between the framing and the points wasn't clear, if the bottom lines weren't always immediately clear, I'll think of a suitable punishment. It will involve lots of shouting.
Corporal punishment.
Not bad.
Well,
Use the
We'll see.
cane.
I'll think of something. I guarantee that it's not going to be funny unpleasant. It's just going to be unpleasant. Now, I want you to call me after the debate also. I'm going to talk to Monica and I'm going to talk to you again. Okay? This is, absolutely.
אני גם נכשלתי.
אני גם נחשבתי.
תומר,
Well, talk
אפשר
about
לעשות
I
סאמרי?
love you, you're great.
אני נכשלתי במשימה שלך.
ביי, חם לי.
לא, אבל חסר לי therefore.
So ask yourself. All right, Oma, go. Guys, I'm sorry you have to see this.
I've never seen
Bye
you.
guys, social thank you. Bye.
Bye, Tomer, we love you.
Keep your notes. You have your notes?
I do.
Good.
Sunday.
Okay, Oma.
I don't know
אוי,
this.
רגע. מישהו יכול בבקשה לציין את עומר? כדי שאני אוכל לראות את הנאום שלו? הכל מצוין?
Gross.
No, that's too much, man. We're talking about some serious stuff. Okay. We're going to show you why we want this debate by 2 clashes. Firstly, by justification, why, even if this is going to create more overall good, we still think that religion specifically is not something that is eligible for a special tax position. And secondly, about whether churches and mosques are going to survive, what's going on with poor communities, and etc. But before that, let's refute this little thing that Tomer accuses us that we run away from the debate, right? They're telling us that we're running away from the debate because we say that under our side of the house, communities would be allowed to fund mosques if they like. Let's see what do we mean here exactly, and what is the meaning of tax breaks, right? We tell you that when we we give all of the churches, all of the mosques, the church as a whole, like a special position of tax breaks, then this is something that the society as a whole always, at all costs, without like in an unreasonable way, pays for. We tell you that if a specific municipality decides, because, like the lawmakers in a specific place decide that for the next term we want to fund this specific church in these and these specific towns, we have no problem with that. We just think that as a blanket policy, this is not something that should happen always, all of the time under our side of the house. Under their side of the house, they need to prove us why churches as a whole are eligible for this special tax position. Therefore, in every circumstance, they should be eligible for tax breaks under their side of the house. They are the ones who are running from the motion at that point. Now let's go to the first clash. We tell you that we think that like institutions are eligible for tax breaks, like in a special position, if they manage to apply for two criteria. Right? First of all, we tell you that they have to be absolutely vital for the society. And what does it mean here? We think that hospitals and schools are things that which we always, under every circumstance, want to give tax breaks to, because they're absolutely vital for the society. On the other hand, things like sports, tennis centers, and ballet centers, and theaters, even like we think that communities are allowed to fund them specifically, but we don't think that they're eligible for special tax breaks from the government at large. We think that it's just because they're not as important. Then the response to that is, yes, religion is something that's important to many people. We think that this is true to an extent, right? We think that many people value the religion to a large extent. We just don't think that this is vital as hospitals and as schools. We think that it's something that's important to people, but more in a way that culture and sports are important to people, and we don't understand how it is in any way similar to the fulfillment of basic rights of people that happens under our side of the house. Then we tell you that inherently, like the institutions which are eligible for tax breaks from the government itself are things which do not need to do major harm to the society. Schools do not harm anybody. Hospitals do not harm anybody. On the other hand, churches almost constantly, almost inherently, are harming and infringing upon the rights of gay people and women and the weaker people, and in a way which we do not think we should encourage and give tax breaks always as a government. This is not something that we need to force the entire taxpayer, the society at large, to pay for, even if they do not give their approval by voting for the parliament to their specific people who will vote for, who will decide for them in the parliament to fund this specific place. Then they're telling us that we also fund things that are racist towards other people, such as parties. And note that this is the only example that they have standing in their case to the other side. And this is a bad refutation from their side, because this is the one example that's extremely easy to distinct on our side of the house. Right? We think that parties are crucial for the existence of democracy, the accessibility of people to parties, even if they are somewhat racist or right-wing, as Maya calls it, is still important for many people. We don't think that a specific stance or a specific opinion is always bad or illegitimate. We just think that we should not give it our approval as a government in encouraging it by taxpayers. We think that if it harms the democracy as a whole, and parties cannot function under their side of the house, cannot gain accessibility to people therefore are underrepresented, then yes, we will fund those parties under our side of the house. It is just distincted from our side of the house. Look, even if what I'm going to say from this point and until the end of my speech is absolutely wrong, and people are going to be harmed as a result of that motion, we think that this is morally wrong to force people to pay for things that harm their society to a large extent, that are not this important to a very large extent, that could be funded in other ways if the public wants it to a very large extent. Now let's go to the second clash about whether they're going to survive. Here we give you a very solid case that does not get very serious refutation from the other side of the house. What do we tell you? That under the status quo, many churches and mosques are very rich and do not utilize the money such as we would have wanted them to do because of taxpayers and because of many other factors. What are they? We tell you donations, right? They are given many donations from the in the status quo for many places. In most scenarios, they're not using that money to support the poor and give them food. They're using it to buy more marble floor to the church, or to build a larger windows with vitrage on them, and to buy rubies for the clothes of the Pope. This is how they use their money in the status quo. We do not accept the ridiculous line about how it is so important for the Christianity as a whole to have rubies on the clothes of the Pope. Nonetheless, we think that the society as a whole should fund that, right? We think that if they need to make a trade-off here, what
what they're likely to, what the trade-off is likely to happen is to help the poor and to give up on many of the things that they have to give up, like many of the fancy things that they have in the status quo. So in the bottom line here, we think that they are likely to get the exactly same amount of money under our side of the house, right? With many people are likely to support them as well. Even if they're getting slightly less money under our side of the house, we still think that they are going to be able to support the poor people and to give them food. They're just going to get to commit some sacrifices for that. We think that this is, for a large extent, a good thing which they're likely to do, and not to see their people starve under their side of the house. But more than that, we tell you that even if a specific place, a specific church or mosque are getting now very poor and cannot support their believers, they are going to be supported by other churches and mosques, right? We tell you that the Christianity and Islam are things which are institutions which are interconnected because of that common faith. And if a specific community is now struggling to feed its people, then I'm going to get the POI.
Yeah. For many religious people, they would prefer to have more activity in the church and be able to worship better, even if that means that they're getting slightly worse care in hospitals. We don't think that this is a trade-off that the government should be able to make for other people.
Okay, we think that if those people, which we think are very, very few under any side of the house, are going to make that sacrifice, then we support that they do it, right? If I, as a person, don't want to buy food for my family, but to go and donate this money to the church, then sure, do it. But we don't think that the government itself needs to do it for him. Now, let's talk about the interconnection, right? We think that all of them are supporting each other when they're facing a major struggle. But even if that's not true, note, if people are literally starving under their side of the house, they have nothing to eat, then yes, we think that we as the government have a way to step in and intervene there and to give them food. This is just not the comparative that we're talking about here. So what do we face here at the end of this debate? Firstly, we think that many of the mosques and churches are going to survive on our side of the house to exactly the same extent. Secondly, we think that they are going to have the ability to make trade-off, even if they weaken to quite a large extent, to still support their believers and to exist. But even if they don't, they are going to have many other people like the Vatican to support them, and the Vatican is very, very rich. We think that for all of these reasons, we have to support. Well,
It's all things.
In the beginning of this debate, we get a criteria from the proposition which says there are things that we believe that need to have taxes paid for them, and the two criteria that these things need to stand under is them being necessary and them not having any other way to fund this. I'm going to explain to you why under propositions metric in two clashes under those titles, why our side and our case still goes under the metric that they give us and is absolutely something that we do need to fund with taxes. Let's start with one of them, right? Let's talk about why they need this money, why they wouldn't have any other way to fund this otherwise. So firstly, we think that the fact that they say, oh, we're just going to fund all the poor churches that need this state-wise is problematic for a couple of reasons. So firstly, we just don't think this is true, and I'm going to get to that in a second, right? But notice that at this point, they already admit to us that there are plenty of times in which their case wouldn't be correct. There are plenty of times in which churches would go under the criteria of needing these taxpayers' money in order to be able to fund themselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to put this extra little piece of framing which says if they can't fund themselves, we'll fund them. When Tamil gets up in a POI, no thank you, and says, wait a second, listen, the large majority of Catholics are poor, we say, yes, that means that the large majority of Catholic churches funded by those people aren't going to be as rich as the Vatican, which means that they will need this help. We think that for a lot of religious organizations, this means that you would have to fund them, and this is running away from too many cases. But secondly, we think that the state would need a very good justification that doesn't come in the proposition's case to why they think that it is okay to intervene, to put together church and state, and why they think that it is okay to intervene in these kind of instances. And Toman gives you analysis on this. He tells you, listen, this is going to be a problem there's going to be a problem because the state is going to make decisions as to what kind of progressive ideas they think are okay in churches, and we think that this is a massive harm in any case. And that justification doesn't come to protect the fact that they are going to fund. And at that point, we think that it is going to be very difficult for them to justify why the state is actually going to fund this, and at that point they lose a lot of the funding that exists. But then they say, churches are going to fund each other because it's their religious thing, and that's something that they want to do. So firstly, we don't think that this is true, right? We think that for big churches within a city, they would prefer for the smaller churches to close down if that means that they are getting more power and more followers to come to that church, and we don't think that they would work particularly hard to save those small churches if they could just say, come to our church, we have more benches, right? We just don't understand why this is true, and they never explain to us why this is true. But even on the numbers game, listen, there's a limited amount of people donating, and even if those people donate more, we think at the point at which you force them to pay significantly more because they don't get those tax breaks, there simply isn't going to be enough money to fund everyone, and you are absolutely harming a lot of these religious places. Cool. No thank you. So when they tell us also then they tell us a lot of churches are rich and running churches is pretty cheap. So this isn't actually going to be a problem. They have a lot of mitigatory stuff, right? Not that much positive stuff. So
on
the issue of churches being rich, we think that notice, as I said, some churches are rich. And when they have so many cases of churches that will need this help and won't be able to get it, that's the point at which we do think that this stands under their metric. Then they tell us, but running churches is pretty cheap. A lot of these churches need to run things that are more than having a physical building, right? They need to have soup kitchens running from within those churches. No thank you. They need to have Sunday schools. A lot of these churches will also have help for students who are struggling in school and things like that, right? A lot of these places have foreign aid and send out people for missions in other countries. These things take a lot of money that you are now taking away from them, and you are now taking away from important missions and things that actually have a lot of positive impacts in the world. Listen. What do I want you to listen to? We think that at the end of the day, they really need this money. If they don't have these tax breaks, it means that they need to compromise on a lot of things. And it means that a lot of churches simply aren't going to have enough funding to be able to continue as they have now. To be able to have all of the beautiful things that they see as part of their worship. Or for many churches to have the basic necessities that allow them to run the church properly and to help the people within that church. So it absolutely stands under the first part of the criteria, which is the fact that they need this money. Before I move on to it.
Charities in the status quo get a special tax status. They will continue to get that special tax status tomorrow. So all the money which currently goes to these to these charities isn't actually being restricted.
No, Tamir. When these soup kitchens are being run from within the church on church funds, right? When you're buying this food with church money, we don't think that it is going to be massively different. Sure, like NGOs that are running from a religious basis, sure, but we don't think that this is the difference. Okay, let's talk about whether or not this is necessary.
Why?
Because, listen, they're not actually fighting this clash. Notice that they're not actually fighting this clash because everything they say on this clash is just trying to mitigate the fact that this is necessary. They tell us it's not as necessary as other things. Churches are oppressive, and so we don't think that they have as much of a right. They never give us any inherent reasons as to why this isn't necessary, while all of the time we do give you a lot of positive material which explains to you why this is massively important. We tell you that for many people, no thank you, living in poor communities, this is the food that they have for the week. This is the help in school that they have. This is their medical, these are their medical resources. For a lot of these people, this is what they have. These are the only pleasant human interactions that they are having because they're working 14-hour days in the supermarket any other day of the week. It is where they get to talk to God. It is where they feel they have a community. It is their home. It is everything for them. It is their identity. When they tell us, oh, it's not that important, we don't buy that. Because for religious people, you wake up in the morning and every decision you make throughout the day has to do with your religion. This is something that is massive massively important to people. And we think that when you take away their beautiful windows, when you take away their ability to worship their God in the way that they think is correct, you aren't taking away their windows. You are taking away their identity. You are taking away the things that are truly important to them. And we think that that's massively problematic. And with just the mitigatory material that they bring us, this isn't enough to prove the point. They tell us the comparative is schools and hospitals. And not only do we think that like a lot of churches do this, and if you take away this funding from churches, then you're going to have to put more money back in because you're not getting help for poor students within the churches, because you're not getting like welfare for these people from within the churches. You're gonna have to put that money in back anyway. But we simply don't understand why this is the comparative, right? They make the decision that this is the comparative, but we don't understand why this is true. The problem today isn't that we don't have enough money, it's that we don't think that this is important enough. We don't understand why in the day of tomorrow, when we have slightly more money from the rich churches, which they're going to tax, then they're going to have all of the things they need. We show you that we stand under their criteria, and for those reasons, we win this debate.
Thanks for the man.
אבל עכשיו שפיים.
רק נאומים גרועים היום, אלא שלי יש לך קטע עם דיבייטים על דת.
כן.
לא נכון. זה השני שנתנו לכם, 3 חודשים האחרונים.
קצת משקר.
אני לא חושב. אני אגיד לך גם כאילו, זה לא שסתם בחרתי דת, כן? דיברתי עם מרים, אמרתי נראה לי או דת או משפט או משהו אחר, אחרי ששבוע שעבר עשינו גם כלכלה וגם פמיניזם, והיא אמרה דת, אז אני אפילו לא בחרתי דת. אני גם חושב שלא היה worlds אחד.
I'll give it to you.
בלי דת.
I love these motions.
Anyway, before you start,
וואי, לא טוב.
no, go and we'll talk about that. Things after. Yeah, go.
מה, אין שלו?
No.
You never ask me questions. Because you're so wonderful. 3, 2, 1, go.
I rarely ask one question. There you go.
Even if the money would go to the poor people and churches no. Okay, Sophie.
7 days to worlds.
Not true. 10 days. Let's be clear.
So, 3, 2, 1. Even if the money would go to the poor people, even if they will go take all these taxes and invest them, the change that they are trying to show won't necessarily happen. We are talking about people who depend on their church for food. Investing this money in a moment in education or infrastructure doesn't mean would give this money for food. We are telling you that the dependence is much deeper than the proposition understands. We believe that the short term, those people doesn't going to get it. Yes, money would be invested. Education isn't going to be changed in a second. We believe these people is so dependent on churches that their situation in the short term is going to be so bad that everything that they are showing to you is they are trying to show to you isn't really going to happen. But we are also winning in the long term, and Avital is doing it good. And Avital is doing it pretty good. Sorry, Avital is doing it good for them. We are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the justification clash that Omer is trying to win their side of the house by just saying that Republicans and other parties besides them being like assholes, they have like something very important that it is democracy. And democracy is super important to us. First, you know what? Cool, this is why we allow it. But we know why we also allow churches, although they are also might be assholes to an extent that they don't really explain to us, but like, let's believe us. because we believe that religion is also crucial. It is also something very important, and maybe this is the analysis that Elijah wanted me to do, and I'll do it now. So we believe that no, it is a rebuttal. Shut up. Okay. So at my first point at my speech, we talked about why those institutions are such a necessity. We also talked about the crucial feeling that those people have, and why it is a necessity, and Avital gives you in POIs in her speech why it's such a crucial thing, and this is why it's just elaborating and more analysis and not new material. Okay, so very cool. So we believe that religious is something that the government from everything gives a special place in its work. We let abortions go away, gay marriage not happen, because we believe that religious has its place that we don't hurt. We believe this is where it happens as well. Yes, there might be a bit of a damage to the other places, but we believe that each individual that is dependent on his feeling to the church, that this is where he goes and prays, this is where he dedicates his life to, because it is more important to him than food. And it is to many religious people and just people who want this place to stop their life. We believe this is something very important to them. This is something which is crucial for their happiness in life. As democracy is something crucial for us managing life, this is the religion is something crucial for any individual that believes in those things to manage his life. We believe that, yes, we might not believe in those ideas, as we've already told you. As we have already told you. But those things are very important for each person, and this is why we believe it's crucial, and the justification just was.
Camille, the smuggest of all smug people. That's the face.
כל זמן.
אל תיתנו לו.
הטלפון שלך.
אתה רוצה לחשב את הבטריה או לא?
לא רוצה לתת.
Yes.
You guys know the phrase big fish in a small pond?
No.
It's like, oh, you're very big, but in relation to the things around you. So Tamir is a smug fish in a straightforward pond. We're earnest, I guess is the word, an earnest pond. Right? It's very smug compared to the rest of you. But there's a lot of smugness out there. So bad.
Man?
Yeah.
When I set out the criterion at the start of this debate, I say the following. We should only fund it if what is taken away by the fact that we stop funding it is vital compared to other things which we could use the money for. Given this frame, which I give you very clearly, why have we won this debate, right? So what is it exactly that is going to not be funded even if we take the best case of side opposition? And Amital tells us this in her speech. She tells us, look, even when local communities and local churches will stop operating, even if we take the best case and they do stop operating, which we don't believe is so likely, the people in these areas can go to the local, bigger church. Because just like Avital tells us, the bigger church are likely to take control of the market or take control or to go out to the believers because they want to have as many believers as possible, just like Avital tells us, and Avital tells us that this is the alternative. Because whether or not you believe you live in Bronx and your local church may be closed down, there's still going to be a church next to you, which is maybe it's even 3 kilometers out, which is bigger, which is better, and which is rich enough not to close down. This is what Avital tells us. Given this, what is the delta on how much religious people are actually limited? So we get 3 reasons why religion is incredibly important according to side opposition. First, they tell us, oh look, religion is in charge of charities in these areas. Notice how charities is simply out of the debate, and I give it in a POI to Avital and she simply mumbles about it. What do I tell you? I tell you that charities aren't affected. Why? Because if they need food to get to these places, we just believe that NGOs will take in the money, or that the churches themselves will have special bills which they say this is the money which we're using for a whole lot of charities. this money won't be taxed because already in status quo, any donations which go directly to charities don't actually already have a special tax status. This means that all money which in the past would have gone to charities continues to go to charities, because if it's important enough for these churches, they just bill the certain money which is going into these areas like this in the first place, and therefore it gets the tax status. The second reason they give us why religion is important is identity. Now, two things about identity. Omel tells you, look, identity simply isn't enough to justify or to put this on par with hospitals. Just like we wouldn't fund sport leagues or we wouldn't fund sport teams, even if you can get a hold of identity, it is not in no way on par with things like hospitals, with things like education, which unlike identity, give you the very soul of life, which is so much more important to us than identity. And secondly, notice you don't stop being religious the moment that your local church is closed, and according to Avital, you just need to drive 2 miles to the bigger church which is next to you. The harm to your identity simply isn't harmed that much, because you're still religious, you're still Christian, and although your local church isn't 100 meters away, it is only 2 miles away, right? So in terms of identity, we don't think there's a much of harm. Now, Maya tells us, oh look, there are other crucial reasons. We don't really get any of them, right? So at the end of the day, we get 2 reasons why it's important. These 2 reasons are simply not enough to make it more important than the alternatives, which are hospitals and education. Now they tell us, oh no, these aren't the alternatives, because had the government had more money, they wouldn't spend it on hospitals or on education. We tell you, this is unlikely. Why is it unlikely? A, we have the fiat to a very large extent say what the money is going to be wasted on. B, because hospitals are incredibly important and we'd like to fund them. We think every government knows that hospitals are important, and we think that it will use the necessary money which it needs to fund it. If it has more money, we believe it will be funding social welfare and things which are good for the majority far, far more. At the end of the day, it comes down to the following question. The local churches, which is their best case, even if they do close down tomorrow, only close down to an extent where it is not harmful enough for the local parish goers to justify that they shouldn't get a hospital, to justify that other people shouldn't get an education. We believe that it is far more good, would be far better if we fund the hospitals that we need, rather than people not walking 2 miles rather than 100 meters to the local church. For these reasons, for
Thank you for your first question. Before we start rushing on feedback, one main question. What is special tax status?
It means that they don't pay arnona, and it means for churches in the status quo, it means that they're viewed as NGOs.
For what purpose?
They don't pay tax on any profits, don't they?
What do you mean by profits?
Money that goes in and out, things
Yeah.
that purchases that they make, any
Right.
kinds of events that they do, they're just like, there isn't tax on it.
Okay.
There isn't.
There is not.
Okay. Now, what does funding mean?
Giving them money to do certain things.
Right. Is special tax status the same thing as funding?
No.
Why not?
Because special tax status gives them a lot more freedom than funding does, because funding means here's
That's reason one.
money.
Yes, that's true. No, sorry. Backwards. But more basic than that. Between special
One is active and one is passive.
right, and the fact that it's passive means that
And bchira.
no.
No, that the government isn't intervening in church matters.
Prior to that,
הממשלה לא...
does it? If I say I'm getting special tax status to this table, does that give anything to the table?
No.
No.
Why not?
Because unless you have profits, it doesn't matter.
Right. So what does that mean? We need even when we do have special tax status,
שהם יעשו משהו.
donations. Profits is not quite the right word here, but yes, this is critical in this debate on both sides, right? Because you guys shift constantly from talking about funding to talking about special tax breaks, right? So when you're talking about hospitals and schools, you're talking about funding. When you're talking
And
about
tax breaks.
it's not meaningful, right? That's not the point. Because even if hospitals did pay taxes, they would just get it back in funding. That's the point here, right? Hospitals get far more in funding. Right, NGOs is the example, and that's the point, is we're calling church activities charitable activities. We're saying it's the same thing, whether you're, carrying out a confession or giving food to a soup kitchen, those are equal. On opposition, this is a critical link that you guys are missing in your analysis. Because as long as you're not telling me why these churches are getting, as long as you're not showing me what exactly the delta is, on the tax break itself, I'm going to have a big problem with your analysis. Because by definition, all the churches that exist today do it solely on the basis of donations. Because they're not getting money from the government. Because we're not getting funding, they're only getting special tax status. It is obviously true that once we take away their special tax status, they'll lose a lot of money. However, they'll still have, at the very least, the same number of donations. We just cut the percentage of taxes. How much is that actually? Is it 50%? Is it 20%? Why is it enough for lots of churches to close? Why is, right? And I need this analysis here. It's going to be difficult because it's probably not going to be true. That's why I wanted you guys to analyze the principle a little more, because analyzing the practical of lots of churches are going to close is not necessarily going to be persuasive, because yeah, I think I would estimate that at best, in most countries of the world, if you tax churches to the maximum degree, property taxes, sales tax, income tax, social security in countries that have mentors or whatever, it would be about 50% of donations at most.
I've got a question.
Now, if you were to cut it by half, some churches would close. I have trouble believing that it would be all small churches. I have trouble believing that that all of it would come at the expense, even if I buy all of your analysis, that all of it would come at the expense of the good activities that churches carry out. And so, at that very, very basic level, you have a real problem versus proposition. Proposition, your analysis is flawed because you also don't understand this distinction, but big parts of the analysis do stand. A lot of the mitigatory stuff does stand, and without my being able to understand why the principle here is inherently justifies the tax rate and doesn't just inherently justify this being an okay thing that will continue to exist, because I still have it tomorrow, right? So yeah, it's something important. I'm going to talk about that. But I'm saying, as long as you don't make the clear connection to me to tax rates, I'm missing an important thing. Is that clear?
I've got a question.
Yeah? Clear? Clear? Yeah.
Are churches interlinked? Like, say I don't know.
You want to ask about churches and charities?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Do they have a
I understand. I think your POI is fair. I think it was fair both times you gave it. I think their response is partially fair. I think it does help you guys. I think with a little more analysis, they could have minimized your point of POI a lot more. But I think you're right but I think that it's true that they're not going to win this debate without successfully defending the non-charitable activities of churches. Right? That's the heart of this debate, and without winning that, it's going to be difficult. Now, I'm saying, so specific. So, if a church carries out soup kitchen activities, yeah, they can get that marked as a charity. The thing is that, as Avital notes, a lot of the things churches do that if it were an NGO would be called charities, churches do in such a way that we're necessarily going to call it church activities. So if, say, we tell everyone in the world, if you come to Mass, you'll get a meal, right, which is very, very, very common across the United States, especially in black churches, then you're not possibly going to be able to claim that you're taking that out of the debate, because then you've lost it, right? That you're not gaining anything. Similarly, with church educational activities, which are going to be intertwined very, very, very fully with religious educational activities. Similarly, with all sorts of support groups for alcoholism, for widowing, for whatever, a lot of those are inherently religious. And so once again, you'll have difficulty separating them. You can say you're separating them, but then Op will be fair in claiming, okay, but then every church is going to get out of paying them anyway, and you haven't gained any of the things you want to gain.
So my question was different though. Not specific churches, but say the Baptist church, right? Large groups of churches, do they have a central bank? Does the Catholic Church have a central bank?
What do you mean a central bank?
Like, does all the money in donations goes to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church separates it to different parishes?
It changes a lot. The answer is no, not necessarily. Like a lot of the time you give it to a specific church, especially since, it depends on the religion and so on. So like the Mormon church, it works a lot more like that. The Catholic Church, it works a little bit like that, but not so much.
And this is why it's true.
Anyway, Baptist churches, it wouldn't work like that at all, and like Congregationalist or Presbyterian churches, it wouldn't work like that even slightly. How do I turn this off?